She's been home for 2 evenings in a row.
Can you send out the review video for the exam?
I will. I have not done it. I will do so. I am okay.
Can you have the closed captions on it again?
Yes, I can. I am contemplating. You're not going to like this.
No, do not say you're getting rid of the online exam.
No, I'm not getting
I was
it.
about to get real mad.
I'm contemplating me doing recording with the lab and sending to it virtually today.
Perfect.
Wait, what?
That would actually work.
No
I
lag.
have some packing.
Really?
Well,
I can go get ready.
And it's
to get
beautiful
picked out.
outside.
yeah. So I think that I will just record what I have to share with you on reproductive for lab today. Because I know it's not. I woke up with a. Every so often, as you get older, certain things happen to you. Every so often, I have a tendency, because of my troubled digestive system, that all of a sudden I aspirate something acidic. It happened in the middle of the night last night. So I didn't feel great all last night. I'm just getting over a headache. I'm fine now, but I basically didn't get a lot of sleep.
You need some Imitrex.
No, I don't like Imitrex.
I don't either. It doesn't work.
My first wife did Imitrex, Maxalt,
I was on Maxo before.
all of these, none of them worked.
No, they don't.
Yes,
So one thing about that, like, you know those melatonin gummies?
yeah.
Why do they amplify night?
Amplify what?
I heard they I took melatonin and I had the worst nightmare of my life.
And for you guys, melatonin, you got to be very careful with. It does. Sometimes it makes people unusually drowsy and not functional during the day. And a lot of times they have any medicine, whether it's over the counter or considered a supplement, can have any side effect.
Okay, because I took them once because I was sleeping bad. I tried them once and I had the worst nightmare, so I never tried melatonin again after that. But I was just curious.
My stepson takes it pretty regularly. Then he started meditating. And he found that before bed really helped him. The guy used to teach you. Yes, sir.
So to be fair, there's no lag.
There was everybody, all you late comers. The side is going to tilt.
We're the good side today. It's only 3 of us.
I was going to make an inappropriate remark, but I'm not going to. So we're not having lab. I will send you the lab. You can put up with me for a half an hour. Are you okay with this, Kyle?
I'm just surprised. I didn't expect that.
Why are we canceling?
I had a very rough
The
night.
sun is out.
I'm just getting over a headache.
Oh.
I almost did not come in.
Me too.
I did not feel great this morning at all.
I almost walked out in the hallway.
So I apologize for if it's inconvenient to those of you who are not packing to go someplace.
Really early.
Yeah, your buddies actually did okay on their test with micro
That's good.
this morning. I was pleasantly surprised.
They were worried about it.
Yeah, they were all right. So without further ado, this is one of my favorite topics, reproductive physiology. So we did the anatomy. I'm going to review the physiological elements of the anatomy that are relevant. We'll do male, and I was going to end up, we generally can get through male and most of female in a day. So I'll work on that and try to get that done. And then once I get done with this, everybody, then I have some selective topics. We have a little bit of nugget on acid-base control that I'm sure we will not start until next week. And we have a little nugget on growth and development and unfortunately on aging, which I can relate to. Okay. Oh, interesting news. I didn't tell my wife yet. I got a contact from my son out in the ocean someplace because they were supposed to be home for Easter, but it's some kind of other mission. You never know what's going on because they can't tell you. Not over that, any kind of channel like that. Do you know what a tiger cruise is? In military parlance, in naval parlance, when they're done with the deployment, they generally allow 1 or 2 nights of family or friends. You can invite one person for to enjoy onboard ship. My son, when he was on his last deployment, his buddy joined him at Pearl Harbor, and they cruised back to San Diego.
Okay.
So it's like you're on a naval ship, but it's kind of like a cruise.
Okay, yeah.
They're going to have one of those from, he thinks, and he's the captain, so he probably has some say. So
Yeah.
as soon as he get it from Florida, from Jacksonville up to Norfolk,
Oh,
and that'll be in June.
so you're having a fiesta.
I'm gonna have a siesta and a fiesta on the cruise.
When they let you go up one of the, wait, never mind. It's not big enough for planes, right? It's only helicopters. You
The
said?
choppers, yeah.
Because I was saying if they get you an F-16.
Yeah, I know it's not. I'll have to be like 85 for one of those if he's in charge of admirals run.
Once he's
run-
up there, Dr. Stein, you gotta go Top Gun Maverick on it. So you gotta go up there, you know?
Oh, really? Tom Cruise, man. So that was kind of I'm really excited about. I would rather have gone to Pearl Harbor, come back by way of Hawaii, but there's nothing wrong with Jacksonville to Norfolk. You guys are not as excited as I was about that. It'll be a lot of fun when my son is the captain of the ship. It's a lot of fun. Patty Graves missed call. What is she calling about? No. Here, hold on. Okay. All right, let me get started. I'm sorry for this inordinate delay of me BSing. Okay, so and I'm going to see what happens with this text. I always have my messages off. So this is male and female repro that we're looking. We did a lot of this in anatomy. Most people have had a lot of this material before, whether you had it or not. And we're not. And this is all the anatomical stuff that's there. Physiologically, what is important is this. This is the anatomical basis. Yeah, and with the same for most of these systems, we have whether it's ovaries or testes, and everything else is a what I would call an accessory structure. It doesn't matter what it is. You should be familiar with all of this because this is that classic axis. Whenever there is a lack of testosterone or estrogen, again, just like we did in endocrine, it triggers the hypothalamus, interprets it, releases gonadotropin release hormone by way of, and we had this question on the endocrine exam. Triggers the release of FH, LH, probably prolactin, and induces that. So it's a standard hypothalamus, pituitary, posterior pituitary, anterior pituitary arc, etc., and negative feedback, with the exception of the interesting things that happen in and around puberty. And we're going to touch on that also in development as well. And inhibin is something that keeps it low from making more, if you will. So you'll see all the inhibin release from gonads, male and female, and negative feedback on FSH release from the anterior pituitary. So that becomes more involved, and we'll see it probably more so in female than in male with that. So that it's worth a quick look. Here's the puberty aspect. Obviously, when it becomes functional, there's a subtle amount of variation. Frankly, it's a little earlier these days by about a year or two than it was, let's say, when I was a kid. There's always a variation. A lot of people wonder about things in the food supply vis-a-vis growth hormone and things like that are, look, there's a lot of shenanigans in the food industry. Understand that. Okay, there's a lot of questionable things that go on. I don't know that this is necessarily as harmful. I understand why people are, very concerned about using organic only, and just how accurately that's monitored, I do not know. I know it's expensive. Okay, so earliest time that reproduction is possible. Okay, and generally not right away. By the way, it takes a certain amount of time. So it only requires low levels to suppress gonadotropin release hormone at the hypothalamus. But for some reason, now that's what the question is, all of a sudden it's less sensitive to this inhibition. And then you get this sort of pulsatile change that occurs in and around puberty that starts the whole process. And depending on men and women, it takes a certain amount of time before the systems come in place and stay in place. It's obviously more finite in women because of menopause, which these days, the last time I looked at the average, probably onset was around age 53, though that varies. And then, and in men, it's a little bit different. It's more prolonged, but then there's issues with that as well. And so all of that stuff, so it acted, releasing all the FSH and LH, okay, et cetera, and it continues to rise, resulting in more and more release. So it alters the normal pattern, at least during the onset of puberty, until such time as the adult pattern is achieved. I'm not doing meiosis and that whole thing again. I'm not doing that with the, the daughter chromosomes and, the meiosis 1 and meiosis 2, other than highlighting certain events. Again, so you understand, and again, we do it more so in female that are there. We have to know we're crossing over there. That's in prophase of meiosis 1. And obviously, the law of independent assortment becomes significant in metaphase of meiosis 1 as well. And the whole haploid and diploid you've had 16 times by now. Doesn't matter. We're not going to do it. Reduction divisions, blah, blah, blah. Here we are, meiosis 1, prophase 1, the tetrads, chiasmata, crossing over, whatever you want to call it. Adds to the randomness we're all familiar with. This is about all I want you to know. Okay, and then in metaphase 1, now you have that, the relatively random alignment, as opposed to something in mitosis where everything is, it's all about making the same one, and meiosis is all about making difference. And I'm sure they have wonderful little illustrations and drawings, and we're not going to do them. Okay, and this is all anatomy. Okay, it takes about 20 days in the epididymis for the sperm to gain enough maturity that they are able to actually swim, and they can store for a significant period of time. That's known. Okay. And again, this is more anatomy that we're going to. While it's noteworthy, I don't think there's a whole lot that goes on with it. The anatomical aspect of the glandular elements. Okay. The seminal vesicles. This is and again, it's a lot of it is pH balance, which we will get to in not necessarily in this chapter or the female chapter. In the growth and development chapter, we do look at it. It's fructose mediated. Fructose is the critical element because that's what sperm cells utilize for energy conversions. Coagulating enzymes to prevent outflow. Prostaglandins stimulate reverse peristalsis frequently in the female to allow, to sort of enhance or accelerate the sperm moving up the birth canal. That's where, if you're interested at all forensically, where that classic pigment that you see on every crime show in the world, but is really used. Ultraviolet light is useful for analyzing things like using spraying and looking for blood, and obviously looking for quote unquote fluids. 70% volume of semen, so the majority portion of it that's there. Prostate, not necessarily mechanism that's necessarily clear. It does impart that milky white color. It's acidic, so it somewhat balances a little bit. It does have that PSA, which is so important physiologically for monitoring prostate disease. We know when it says plays a role, if they knew the role, they would define it, which they do not. And about 1/3 of the volume, this is just a lubricant. Okay. The whole problem below. I hate reading this. I'll tell you what I tell a lot of people. Don't get old. Though the alternative is not necessarily that. You couldn't. I've always been, hey, look, I'm still in touch with my 13-year-old boy.
That's terrible.
It is terrifying.
Same person, just different.
Yeah, I got you. Okay, fructose for ATP, etc. Alkaline fluid neutralizes the acidity of the male urethra and female vagina. So we're pH balancing because a lot of remember that the acidity vaginally is really the barrier to a lot of infectious disease. We will get to that when we start talking about lactobacillus yet again, which is so important to remember. You should have had some of that in micro. If you didn't, we'll go over that again. That's really so. What do we know? Prostaglandins decrease the viscosity of the mucus cervically, reverse peristalsis, relaxin, enhancing it. Obviously, we're going to have a certain amount of the ATP that's coming mostly from the fructose, immunological response, some antibiotic type of chemicals, clotting factors, and that's what they talked about. The coagulase that's there can deconstruct, but in the same time, you'll have certain coagulants that will minimize sperm outflow once it's deposited. So not a whole lot there. There's a variety of things, and we talked about this, that it's the stimulation, the excitement phase, both male and female, parasympathetic in nature. We went over that in endocrine. It's that real, or rather, autonomic nervous system. That's the balance. These are two systems that are, pardon the expression, intimately involved in the control of the sexual response that are there. Okay, so what does it do? They innervate, and they are within that internal pudendal artery, which is the artery in the male that's so significant. They lead to the parasympathetics, the release of the nitric oxide. That's all about relaxing the local smooth muscle, and it allows for engorgement in the reproductive structures. So the cavernosa, expands in such a way it doesn't allow for venous drainage. That's the engorgement or the erection that forms. The spongiosum, because remember, anatomically it's circular, it allows the urethra to remain open. All the different things that can induce that. There's just so many factors that are there. It's reflexive, and once we end up to the ejaculation and / or climax, if we were talking about female repro, we'd have sympathetic nerves that result in all of the following. These are the contractions of the ductus deferens, moving the sperm from storage in the epididymis, prostate, seminal glands, empty the contents into the prostatic urethra, and then again additional contraction, and then the expulsion of urine or reflux of semen into the bladder because that sphincter has been activated. Okay, and so this is that rapid series of contractions. It's expelled at rather a rapid rate. I always use the same terrible joke. You want me to use the same terrible joke?
Oh yeah, lay it on us.
Okay. 4 more miles an hour, we get a ticket in a school zone.
Yeah.
All right, yeah, maybe I shouldn't have said that. That's on me, guys. I'm sorry. I'm canceled. I'm canceled. I guess yeah.
Cancel culture. And all the other things that go along with it.
I do it again.
And then there's the idea of resolution and there's another significant distinction between men and women, because there's a certain amount of refractory period that varies, lengthens with age, as most things do. And again, minutes to hours, it depends. Again, that's one of those interesting things that's variable in certain individuals. So before, that was something of not a very good movie that talked about, it was a George C. Scott movie whose name escapes me. It was terrible. We just see it in the movies.
Would we have seen this movie, or is it like a?
Yeah, you probably would not want to see this movie.
What's
It's called
about?
Hardcore. It was about a daughter who got away from a religious retreat and got stuck in the porn industry.
Yeah,
And it talked about, and this is pre-Viagra days. So it was very interesting about, because they didn't have those kinds of pharmaceutical agents that are so used extensively now. Okay, so again, and so ED, very common for a variety. We think there's environmental factors as well as medications, alcohol, a variety of things. It's notorious with alcohol and a variety of different antihypertensive drugs. Okay, there's ones that are chronic problems. Again, I remember that anecdote I shared with you about diabetes. Clearly affects this system. Clearly affects this system significantly. Okay, so that's it. I don't do the spermatogenesis nugget so much. Typically, I think the age may be older or younger. You can see there's a vast majority that are made. There's so many that are within an ejaculation, as we went over before. We're talking typically a couple of 100 million in a relatively small amount of, maybe between a half a teaspoon and a teaspoon of ejaculant that's there. The cells, again, to me, this is more anatomical than anything else. The testosterone, interstitial cells of Leydig, the spermatogenic cells, and the seminiferous tubules for sperm, myoid, muscle-like for contraction. Neat things to remember that are there. And then this is which I don't do with the spermatogonia and a note to those in the MCAT class, that's something you should know the distinction between, even though I don't do it because I don't feel we need to go crazy with that. It's the idea between a primary to secondary spermatocyte, what is effectively formed at the end as spermatids. They are, and then as they mature, then we actually see sperm when we see finally the development of, really the mature form is visible that are there. So they're just showing you that transition. So that's useful to review. So the spermatids, even though they're haploid, they're non-modal, and then as they mature within the epididymis, again, anatomically, we looked at this. The acrosome is the interesting part. The head has the genetic material. The acrosome is the cover with the enzymes that facilitate particularly penetration of the outer layer of the egg. And it needs multiple ones to create a channel for whatever sperm. That's why that vast majority, compared to with all the defense mechanisms and the randomness of what actually gets to its location, the fact that it's usually on one egg on one side or the other, not both. Typically, a rather small number compared to the couple of 100 million that start the process make their way to the final region that are there. The mid-beast is all about movement. The tail is just the appendage that facilitates locomotion. That's what they look like microscopically that are there. It takes, under normal circumstances, we're talking here a couple of months. So again, it's fluid that moves it along before they gain it. Okay. And again, this is the supporting cells and what they do. Again, more anatomical. Noteworthy, the blood testicular barrier. We said this in immune. We probably said this a little bit before. This is one of those interesting areas. Since genetically they become formed at post-puberty, these are excluded from the non-self determination that's made during your first 6 months. So for men, when there is a tumor, trauma, anything that could strew damage or a weakness in that area, for whatever reason, conceivably we could have an immunological response that's there. And so whether it's the fluids that are there, different binding proteins. So as you can see, these are different kinds of mediators that come from these. Cystenocytes are like cells that form materials that enhance or increase the ability for sperm cells to develop. And again, the inhibin inhibits spermatogenesis by inhibiting FSH release. So when there's a sufficient number, this becomes more active unless circumstances dictate otherwise. And the note of infertility, again, I have my context for those that didn't have me in the anatomy part of the program is having been an infertile couple, my first wife and I we went to, I can't even begin to tell you how many specialists. We went all over to try to have children biologically. The the sum and substance was 20% of the time it's the male, 60% of the time it's the female, and 20% of the time they don't know. Now, maybe that changed. We're talking about 1980 through 1983, that area. Seeing literally world-renowned specialists at the Hospital of University of Pennsylvania, considered the leading authority on infertility. Doctor named Cesar Ramon Garcia, who was at the Hospital University of Pennsylvania. So it's a long time ago, and I'm sure he's long gone. But the reality is sometimes you just can't get an answer that's there. So we're seeing this decline. That's where we start looking at food sources, chemicals. Conspiracy theorists will tell you that that there are people who are trying to reduce the birth rate significantly, considering that, trying to deal with quote unquote population explosion. It's not my job to go into those things. I don't know what classes you study that in, but it would be interesting. Or sociology classes, I don't know. But every so often you see little nuggets about that type of thing. So foreign molecules, toxins, solvents from plastics, pesticides, herbicides. Think of what we eat, and that's where a lot of people are shifted into what they hope is organic. That's actually truly organic, if you wish. Okay, other possibilities for why. And to me, it's interesting, and it's worthwhile at least chatting about. Estrogen-like compounds that we find in whether it's food sources or other sources, antibiotics. Tetracycline is not used a whole lot. It's interesting that it's used a lot for acne. If you know somebody who's taken something called Minicin or Vibromycin, they take mini doses of tetracyclines, which is a well-known treatment. Minicin and Vibromycin are minocycline, and the other one, Vibromycin, is also, they're both in the tetracycline family. Radiation, lead, marijuana for those who indulge, excessive alcohol, etc. Calcium channel defects, hormonal imbalances, thermal related and again, so there's a laundry list of things there's a certain amount of like do's and don'ts for people who are concerned about potential male aspects of infertility or in general aspects of infertility. There's that axis again that I talked about. So please go over that because I think it's part of it. Again, the distinction: follicles stimulate sperm, luteinizing hormone stimulates the production of testosterone. FSH also indirectly stimulates the other cells in the area, the sustentacytes, that sort of do a little bit of everything to release this androgen binding protein, which is able to maintain high levels of testosterone near the spermatogenic cells, so they're more likely to generate. Okay? And rising testosterone levels trigger spermatogenesis that's there. And again, all the different secondary sex characteristics you're familiar with, etc. Okay? And this interesting chart. Before birth, while the eventual aspect of masculinization, because at birth, generically for the first, 5 or 6 weeks, we all develop as female, and as my recollection is, and when we look at the growth and development, I'll have a little bit more information about it as I review it. And then roughly then we have whatever that gene, you surely did it in cell molecular, that SXY or genetics, isn't that the gene? Anybody? See, you're helping me. What? And so when that begins to demonstrate, that's why we see that jump in testosterone levels, I think, in the brief levels. So the male infant, even at birth, has 2/3 of the adult. And so you have this early rise as a completelet and then goes down low. And then as we get to puberty, then all of a sudden that pattern develops. So you see it here. At fertilization, during development, you can see how it starts roughly early on, let's say after around first month or so of development. Then we begin to see that even at birth, some residual levels that are probably having to do with certain aspects that occur, though I'm not familiar with them. And then as you can see, up until the onset of puberty, boom, and all of a sudden we achieve adult levels in the young male relatively early on. The post-puberty male doesn't take long. Okay. So theoretically, once they're actively producing sperm, they could actively be utilized for fertilization. And as you can see, it depends on when it diminishes. But there's ample evidence of men biologically, directly fathering children older. There have always been a lot of issues as to just how intact the genetic aspect is. Are they more prone to subtle and sometimes not so subtle genetic defects that are there? I've seen cases or read about cases where the children are, perhaps, during maturity demonstrate some irregularities, not terrible, but, ones that are suggestive of problems. Okay. And it takes about 3 years to achieve the balance that's typically there. And in the absence of whether they're the gonadotropins, FSH, LH, or the GnRH, at that point, testes would act so they have a delicate balance between each other. We know it's from cholesterol converted to what, and you hear a lot about this on TV because they're promoting a lot of products that are in the supplements category rather than farm. Remember, supplements are not subject to governmental control unless there's such a vast problem with them. So if we used to watch Shark Tank all the time, where they would have somebody come up with nutritional supplements. Well, they were always, if you didn't have a lot of testing done, you could have a lot of problems associated with it. So years ago, we used to see a lot, and still do, a lot of commercials involving these kinds of substances that were there. So you can see that it's converted in prostate, but even in the brain, we actually have some usage of active estrogen substances. Okay, multiple anabolic effects. It's clearly testosterone is very much anabolic in nature. So whether it's coming from testicular testosterone or the more interesting ones from the adrenal cortex, I think that's the reticulata, the most inner aspect of the adrenal cortex. That's where during the Balfour days when Barry Bonds and all that stuff was going on. Most of you guys weren't around, but you're familiar with it. When they had this whole thing with baseball, with performance-enhancing drugs really reaching their zenith because they weren't really testing. That's where they would look for the substance, these ones that were sort of performance-enhancing precursors that were, and you could keep making new ones because they were harder and harder to detect rather than just testosterone levels per se. So that in itself was interesting as well. So I mean, I don't know maybe they're just training better today. When you can see, again, now we're starting to see, at least baseball-wise, what appears to be increases in home run production back to those days a little bit more. Maybe they just adjusted the ball, as baseball has been known to do. That's what you love about opening day in Pittsburgh. Hope springs eternal. So I said after Friday or Thursday, I said, stop the season. Pirates are in first place. Now they lost the next 2 games.
We'll be back.
Yeah, I know, but will it be in our lifetime?
It would be cool to see.
Oh, heck yeah. So the secondary sex characteristics, you can read them as well as I can read them, and that's that. Hey, happy dance. Move on briefly to female. We got to just introduce it in the 5 minutes or so that we have left. Part B, 26 you all. It's easily findable. I think it's in week 4 of Blackboard. If you don't know where they are, you want to do a quick review. And so the interesting thing about this physiologically, male is easy. This is more complex. Because here, now we have to look at the relationship of two cycles, the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle, and the hormones that impact them. That's why, vis-a-vis infertility, there is a lot more complexity to this area. And again, I don't know necessarily, like I said, with my first wife, and I told many of you, she had polycystic ovary disease, she had other genetic disorders that were there, and it was something, and even between a variety of ways to try to enhance it, as well as in the early days of IVF, we were always unsuccessful. So go figure. Go figure. Those types of things. But never, and it's just something you always miss. I think if you want to have children, I think that was always something that I know impacted her tremendously. Okay, and she used to call it the death of the unborn child. That because she was not, when she wanted to and was unable. Not everybody has to want to have children. Things like that. But it's interesting to give some insight into some of the things that impacted her. That we did. Yeah, who knows? So much more complex. So the basic stuff's the same. You have the primary structures, the ovaries, everything else, every other structure, whether it's vagina, uterus, cervix, fallopian, doesn't matter. Any of the glandular structures, all the same. Estrogen and progesterone rather than just simply testosterone. The whole system, we need to, I don't know, we'll sort of glancedly review most of it. An interesting system, and you can review the anatomy of it, though I'm certainly not going to go into it. That's there. They call them ligaments. They're really mostly, they don't bear a resemblance to ligaments having to do with bone. They're different kinds of a structure that are much more about blood vessels, nerves, and lymphatics that play a very important role in maintaining the proper alignment. The difficulty when there's infection, it spreads throughout that, and very famously, and we deal with it a little bit in this chapter that's there, and we'll deal with it subsequently, is pelvic inflammatory disease. So when there's infectious disease in the area, and whether it is in the old days more often gonorrhea or chlamydia or trichomonas or anything, any of the other ones that are around, when you have PID, pelvic inflammatory disease, it impacts the whole system. And the end product, it means that the infection has traveled into the tubes, into those multi-ligamentous structures, into the ovaries, and the impact is ectopic pregnancy, early onset of hysterectomy, early onset of infertility. And so it's always has the end product is the same. What's interesting, and we did look at this a little bit with the MCAT students, is the interior. If you look at this as an ovary, the interior, the medullary area, blood vessels, nerves, lymphatics. The exterior, the cortical area, is where we see the eventual development of the egg. And again, it's much more complex than just sperm being produced and maturing in numbers. Here, we have the interesting part about one egg being selected, being a primary follicle that develops an elaborate surrounding area that eventually encases it. And when the egg is ovulated, what we're left with is a structure. The rest of this so-called follicle becomes what's called the corpus luteum. And that really takes the role up of the placenta in the event of fertilization until the placenta actually forms. The view we take of this when I explain it to you is in the concept of what happens, because the goal of the reproductive system is to develop a fertilized egg. So that's the best way I think to study it. I mean, anything that interrupts that process at any level is what accounts for infertility. So we need to look what happens if fertilization and implantation occurs or if it does not. So the two cycles are the ovarian cycle, how the egg develops, how it's expelled, what hormones control it, and the menstrual cycle, what events are going on in the uterus. And from anatomy, you'll remember the stratum basalis, which reforms, and then subsequently the enlargement of and the development of the stratum functionalis where implantation occurs. Voila. And we marry those two chart-wise, graphically. It's kind of like when we studied the heart. Remember, we had all those, we had the EKG and the pressures and dichrotic notch. Same kind of deal with this. We sort of compare events and what happens and what does for them. That's how you understand it, I think, if you try to. So, and this is vascular supply, and we've done this previously. Uterine arteries, there's an ovarian branch, and it's interesting. This is not the same artery that does the thing with regard to menstruation. That's a branch that's a uterine artery coming off the internal iliac artery. Different arterial system. Just like in the male, analogously, you have a hard cover, a hard tunic, because they use the old Latin terms, the albuginea, white hard connective tissue, versus which is the sort of the softer tunic, the vaginalis, which sort of is there for its functioning within the abdominal pelvic cavity. Okay? So each ovary has the tunica albuginea is then covered by a cuboidal epithelium, which is part of effectively the peritoneum. And so you can see what's going on here, what it looks like intact. Now all the blood vessels, nerves, etc. And now you begin to see what's going on vis-a-vis the start of development here. Working its way until we have a mature egg, a mature follicle, which is swallowed up, so to speak, by the fimbriae, and there's that significant anatomical difference. It's expelled into the peritoneal cavity. So it's not like the male where it's a continuous set of structures from the seminiferous tubules into the epididymis, into the vas or ductus deferens, and finally out. As opposed to here, it's got to go back in, and so that's a pitfall that occurs. So we'll look at all of those, a little bit about how it develops. I'm not going to review all of these things, which are anatomical, etc., the regions of the tube, and the whole idea that the fimbriae, those little finger-like projections, stiffen and they have a cilia-like action. They're almost like pseudostratified ciliated columnar, secreting mucus, and it creates little eddies and currents that sweep that expelled oocyte in toward the fallopian tube. Okay? And the ones that are non-ciliated, they end up with nourishing the oocyte and even the sperm to a certain extent. And so when it's fertilized and implants, be it in a tube, when it's not anything that's ectopic is not where it's supposed to be. It's like an ectopic beat in the heart. And here's the nugget about PID, which is always bad. And this is just to conclude with this. It's the same idea. The system doesn't show a lot of problems. Maybe there's some subtle drainage. Maybe it's relatively asymptomatic. It may not be something that appears to someone as being abnormal. And all of a sudden, massive pain, fever, they go in and have a pelvic examination, they have PID. It's another one of those where it goes from being, maybe there's a minor problem, all of a sudden it's red line. Not a whole lot of in-between changes that suggest it's getting worse, I better get this looked at. So I figure I'll conclude with that nugget. I'll pick this up and send you a lot of the discussion here, which you should look at. And other than that, I'm going to be here for a little while longer. If for some reason you need me, which I hope